Okay, well, welcome Arjun Singh for our third talk today about basically what's going on with the coalition, the campaign trail, and the budget. Looks like it'll be coming this week or next week or maybe next year. But we'll start off first by the campaign trail. I'm just reading a bunch of papers, and all the pundits are saying it's in between Patrick Brown and Pierre Poliver. And what do you think? About what's going on in the campaign trail. And do you agree with the pundits or some others?
Well, well, I was actually at a rally hosted by Pierre Poilievre in East Gwillimbury yesterday, which is a few hours drive north of Toronto. And in terms of what I heard over there, it's definitely sort of heating up, and Pierre Poilievre is getting a lot more aggressive now. The biggest line from that speech was an attack on Jean Charest and Patrick Brown for supporting the carbon tax. And that's something that's, quite resonant because even though we have a point system in the Conservative Party for each riding to sort of have equal weight. Most of the votes and most of the members who are voting, at least to support and provide donations, are in the West. That's the Conservative stronghold. So Pierre Poilievre is definitely trying to lock up that part of the country while also getting the rural ridings in sort of his column as well. Jean Charest, interestingly, got an endorsement from an Ontario premier recently. I'm not sure if it was Mike Harris or Ernie Eves or somebody like that, but he definitely did. He's been going around the country, but his campaign, I don't think, has done as many large scale public rallies as previously. And so, again, based on the conversation we had last week, Jean Charest is someone who's starting at a bit of a disadvantage despite having a so-called supposedly impressive resume. Because he's not been in politics for a while, he still needs to perhaps catch up, brush up himself, his own skills, as opposed to just the organizational side. Patrick Brown, of course, has been sort of like, I said last week, he's inching forward into second place as opposed to Jean Charest. It's very much looking like if there is going to be a top two race or top two candidate here, then it's going to be Poilievre and Patrick Brown. As for what he's been doing, he's not made any major policy announcements recently. It's mainly been sparring between him and Poilievre. And in fact, the biggest sort of news item from the campaign in this last week since we last spoke has been the Twitter feud between them on certain issues. So we're in the preliminary stages right now. It's very silly, and that's because the real campaign has not started yet. The candidates are still in the process of getting certified, getting the party to vet them, selling memberships, raising money, ensuring they have their signatures. I've heard through sources that Pierre Poilievre's team has got that done already, so they are sort of certified. The other two candidates have to do that, and they will do it most likely. But again, we're still in very preliminary stages. The real meat of this race has not come yet. It's still cooking.
Yeah, I concur. It starts with the Twitter war, but the debates will happen. I read something from Candace Bergen, who requested that on Twitter, of course, that no one calls anyone a non-conservative. It's don't try to out your competitor of being not a conservative. And what do you think about that part of the angle? Because I honestly thought it wasn't helpful when Aaron O'Toole was doing that to McKay. I thought it was it was bad towards the conservatives, and I personally am happy she said that because it's because I believe this party is already ready to blow up from minute one, and it's just instigating. What are your thoughts?
Well, you're absolutely right to suggest that party unity is something that the Conservatives need to focus on. It's a big tent party, which is quite unlike most right of center or right wing parties in other countries around the world. And that's because of the unique nature of sort of Canada's ideological landscape. The Conservatives are at a disadvantage sort of in respect of capturing plurality opinion. So they need to ensure that they always work towards the other side. And what Candace Bergen said as the interim leader, she also has to be concerned with party unity. So I think she's sort of laying the groundwork for this race to ensure that it doesn't turn out to be as divisive as the last one. And, it's divisive by Canadian standards, of course, but even then, we have to ensure, at least, strategically speaking, the Conservatives have to ensure that whoever wins, they're able to capture the supporters of the last two in order to move along for the ride for the general election whenever that's going to happen. Peter MacKay, after he was defeated by Aaron O'Toole, shut shop and went to Atlantic Canada. He didn't participate in the campaign, even though Aaron O'Toole moved closer towards his side of the political spectrum after he was elected leader. And that's the kind of division that the Conservatives just cannot afford. So what Candice Bergen is saying is helpful, but I really don't think that it's going to do anything to sort of upset the tenor of the race. Ultimately, she's the interim leader. She's a caretaker. She has some influence, but again, the candidates are in it to win it, and they will say and do whatever they can to win it. And, by all accounts, Pierre Poilievre, Patrick Brown, these are not people who are known for playing nice. They're known for getting dirty. They're not progressive conservatives. They're aggressive conservatives. And that's part of their appeal. So they're going to push on that hard.
Yeah, you know what? You brought me back to. I concur. I concur with that one. So, well, moving along, the budget may be coming. At least we've been reading 1 week, 2 weeks. What do you expect it to be a large one? Do you think there's military spending in that? What do you expect with the budget?
So the last time we spoke, I said that military spending would be something that the government would strongly consider because the Ukraine situation was very much in the public mind. And as with any budget, even though it has to be somewhat of a long-term focus, ultimately the short term, the news cycle, what's driving the agenda over the next several months or even within that week span of time can make in changes at the last minute to the government's planning. So at that point in time, it was looking as though military spending was going to be a big focus. And even Anita Anand had said something about the government refocusing its priorities, taking a rethink of Canada's defense policy, which has always been, since Trudeau came to power, one of retraction, withdrawing from the world, just doing that, cursory stuff of peacekeeping. But now, especially after the Liberal NDP supply and confidence agreement, I think that we're going to have to expect that the Liberals have to deliver something, in response to those policy priorities. And so if there's anything that's going to sort of define the budget, it's going to be some of the policies or promises that are made in that agreement on childcare, on pharmacare, on dental care, on climate change, perhaps sort of working on taxes for the wealthy, although that's a more tertiary policy that was introduced in that agreement. But if we want to interpret the budget this far out, and I say far out because, as you intimated initially, we don't know when it's exactly going to be released. And again, something could come up. There could be some event that pushes it forward. Governments, especially this Liberal government, does not like to release budgets. They like to sort of prolong things as long as they can. So we have to sort of wait and see. But if the budget is going to be defined by anything, view it through the lens of this coalition agreement.
Yes, and on the coalition agreement, in my view, I'm seeing it. I was just reading everything that's on their list, and if it goes ahead, I believe it actually will help the NDP. Though I'm a pessimistic on this, I believe that the way I've read it, the tea leaves. The first year with the dental, we'll just focus on the dental at first. First year is 12. Next year is under 18, and then the 2025, the full meal deal. So it seems, and that's the essence of all of the deals. It's string you along. And what do you think about that? Do you think it's just a string along, and or is this a solid plan? Do you believe that could keep them together?
So in my last answer, I didn't call it a confidence and supply agreement. I called it a coalition agreement because that is really what it is. I mean, this lays the groundwork. This basically, on one hand, formalizes what we've already known for a very long time, ever since the Liberals won or sort of lost their majority earned a minority in 2019. The NDP has basically been their sidekick party to move forward with progressive priorities to the extent that they can. And this agreement essentially just formalizes that. It brings them in. It gives the NDP something in return for having supported the Liberals for all this time. Now they are seen as relevant. Now Jagmeet Singh is seen as having accomplished something with his leadership, as opposed to just sort of winning, winning leadership races, but every time the NDP has them, but losing elections every time they are held. So it's a new lease on life for Jagmeet Singh to stay relevant, which is, I guess, what he really needs to, keep his caucus in line, keep his party sort of behind him. But ultimately, the NDP has, by all accounts, over the last few years, been reduced to a state of sort of indentured servitude to the Liberals. And this is just the contract that has now been signed to formalize or codify that status. The NDP is subordinate. They're not driving the agenda. They are basically, in lockstep with the Liberals, and that most of the progressive left-wing priorities that were previously sort of NDP positions, whereas we'd see the Liberals sort of in the center. When the Liberals have lurched leftward, it's left no room for the NDP. So the seats that they keep winning are based on sort of legacy seats, loyalty seats to MPs in those ridings who have built up some local base. It's not a party that's driven by ideas anymore. And so I think that what we see now is the Liberals and the NDP basically establishing a tandem agreement in preparation for perhaps further integration that we're going to see. The Liberals and the NDP, there's been talk about them merging as parties for years. Previously, we thought that this was not going to happen because they were still ideologically quite different. But now we're seeing that difference become narrower and narrower with every passing day. At some point in the future, people are going to ask, well, what's the point of sort of having two different parties if, they're essentially saying the same things? And I think that's, at least as the trajectory currently stands, what we're going to see in the future.
Yeah. And well, what I see was we're going to have, I think this is my prediction, sorry, but that C11 and all kinds of controversial bills are going to be put forward right away. The ones that are going to make the NDP look bad for supporting, because I believe that the online streaming Act C11, it's going to have a lot of pushback, like C10 did, that was shut down by the Senate, due to elections. Though, so what do you think are your thoughts on C11 if you've had a chance to look at that? And also, a caveat to that is we had a couple of pundits and people have said that they don't completely understand the bill. Parts of the bill, it has to be explained further because they're not sure how cabinet. One specific piece is that cabinet can have a say on CRTC. Now, that to me, believe that's government intervention into the CRTC, which is in also which will push down on content providers, broadcasters. So I'd leave it at your feet there.
So you're absolutely right to suggest that C11 is as concerning as C10. Whenever government tries to step in and regulate speech, that's when you have a problem. That's when that the government is trying to basically sort of change the landscape, change the opinions that are available so that, consumers across the country, Canadians, people who aren't involved in politics, but are nonetheless tuning in on social media very frequently, are able to only get a sort of tailored amount of content for themselves so that they constantly align with the views of the Liberal Party or the party that's in power. We saw a similar bill to C11, online extremism, be introduced in the United Kingdom, actually, by Boris Johnson's government. And that's where you had some ferocious pushback on some of the measures over there, because essentially they amounted to government stepping in to control the speech, even when it was dubious as to whether something was extremist or not. And in today's cancel culture, in today's environment of censoriousness, what is extremist in previous years was actually considered mainstream and probably objectively still is mainstream, but it's now being called as such by the left, and thus everyone, or at least those who are not involved in politics, who don't have as much of a skin in the game and are not scrutinizing things as much as the rest of us political junkies are, they are more inclined to accept that view, and thus the speech gets suppressed. So C11 is a big concern. I think we're going to see some pushback on that, just as we saw with C10, not just from sort of the opposition and a smaller opposition now, given that the NDP is sort of essentially part of the government, but we're going to see some opposition from within the Liberal Party as well, because the moment you start to sort of take an aggressive stand against speech, the moment people start to feel afraid, that's when your own backbenchers are one of the people who sort of stand up and at least put internal pressure, if not external pressure, on trying to moderate that kind of legislation. We actually saw this during the Freedom Convoy as well, where those two MPs from the Liberal Party actually came out in opposition to what Justin Trudeau was doing, and then we saw the Liberal government, step back from some of the extreme rhetoric that they were using. So I think that's the kind of convulsion that we're going to see with C11, just as we saw with C10. Ultimately, I don't think that both bills are going to sort of get very far, because again, they have to go through the Senate as well. And even though the Senate has essentially been quote unquote sort of made independent by the Liberal Party with the ISG, they are still more or less partial towards sort of the government and this idea of being a body of sober second thought. But I think that when push comes to shove, the Senate has been willing to sort of sit on bills, let them die, slow them through the process, just so they can run out the clock. And they did that with C10. I think they're going to do the same thing with C11, because when people get to understand what the bill is about, they really don't like it, as we saw with the last one.
Yeah, it's it. And on a separate but same subject, Trudeau was mentioning about how there's he put $2.5 million towards looking at disinformation, and he was talking about divisive speech, and as I was reading that, I'm thinking, what did he call the people at the Freedom Convoy before they even got there, or had a chance to do anything? But here's something that happened this week that was kind of big news. CBC didn't cover it very well, I believe. Trudeau, Justin, was over at the EU Parliament, and he was first of all, he did a speech, and it was to an empty room. It was only about five actual EU member parliament that were there to watch the speech, and it was a speech to kindergartners. And then he got called out by the Croatian minister, by the Lithuanian minister, I believe, and a couple other EU Parliament MEPs. And what are your thoughts on that, and Trudeau's, I guess, floundering support in Europe at the moment?
So, it's odd that the Lithuanians and the Croatians would actually sort of call out Trudeau, because even though they may have legitimate concerns, and they probably do with Canada's foreign policy, the fact is that in this moment, NATO needs to remain united, that, the fewer divisions that are laid bare in public, the better, because then that's what ensures that the push against Russia to ensure that, they don't control Ukraine and that NATO's eastern flank can be defended, that's what they're focused on. So I was surprised to hear that, there were expressive divisions. I would think that these would be done behind closed doors. But leaving that aside, the concerns that Croatians and Lithuanians and other allies and even Canadians themselves have been expressing of Trudeau's foreign policy for the last almost 7 years now is quite legitimate, because our foreign policy, as I mentioned in one of my earlier answers today, has been one of retraction. We haven't seen Canada take a strong stand in the world, use its tremendous resources, its tremendous wealth, its tremendous economic potential to actually invest in its military, to amass hard power that it can then use to contribute to collective defense in NATO, to contribute to peacekeeping around the world, which is seen as, by Canadians at least, as something that, defines its international image. And we haven't seen Canada take a strong stand on a whole host of other issues, political issues, provide economic aid, etc. It's been a policy of retrenchment. The fact that the foreign minister keeps changing after, every election cycle or every 1 or 2 years is indicative of the fact that Canada's foreign policy really doesn't have any consistency. It's just sort of responding to the moment, because ultimately, I don't think that Trudeau really cares about foreign policy. I think that his ideological sort of worldview is one of a Canada that is splendidly isolated from the rest of the world on a northern fringe, protected by the United States and NATO, left to its own devices so that it can continue to be a middle class state undergirded by social programs ruled by the Liberal Party in splendid happiness. That's what Justin Trudeau's vision for Canada is, not a nation that is involved in the world, not a nation that has a will to power or aspires to be a force for good. And that's what we're seeing play out now.
Yeah, I like that splendid isolation. And yeah, it seems like that. And one he mentioned years ago was that he believes his role is mostly ceremonial. And well, if that's the case, it's not working over anymore when we don't even have EU MEPs to watch your speeches. And it goes on that. And one thing, I don't know if I may have to cut it out, but I did notice, because I've been watching a lot of this Ukraine footage, soldiers, some of the tactics that they're using are Canadian tactics. It's just a couple of the battles were, so the training that was provided the last 4 years by JTF2, it's actually maybe a part of the reason. And I read something from Zelensky about how he thanked Canada for that support. Now, at the time, though, they weren't giving them lethal aid, though. I think that's completely changed. Though we're not giving the numbers that Sweden just did, and so on that. Do you think that's going to be going forward? We're going to be because MP Freeland, of course, she being a Ukrainian background, she seems to be pushing it, and she's holding the money bag per se. So I don't know, to bring this part in there.
Well, I will say this, that the fact that, Sweden is giving more aid than Canada, the fact that these small European nations are more consequential than one of the allied victors of World War II, one of the founding members of NATO, is a mark of shame for this country. It hasn't been investing in defense. It hasn't been investing in its allies. It hasn't tried to acquire the assets that are necessary to be relevant in the world where might still does undergird diplomacy. As Mao said, all political power emerges from the barrel of a gun, and Canada's is very small right now. Contingently, it has very little influence. So that should be a sort of mark of shame for most Canadians, that these nations are doing more than a massive country like us, which could be doing so much more. But as for the politics of providing further aid to Ukraine, the institutional attitude that NATO has taken thus far is that it just wants to it doesn't want to prolong the conflict, of course, but it wants to prolong the state of an absence of warfare between NATO and Russia. It does not want to have any instance of conflict between NATO forces and Russian forces. It does not want the Baltic states to have to invoke Article 5, because that would draw NATO states into a conflict, even if it's just conventional, not nuclear. And that's something that NATO member governments are pathologically afraid of from a political standpoint. Ultimately, the only way that NATO and Russia's differences can be reconciled, the only way that Ukraine can actually be ensured of its sovereignty, is if NATO takes a much more assertive stand against Russia. And that's not by providing lethal aid. That's not by simply sanctioning them in Russia in as many creative ways as can be devised. It means confronting them in a direct fashion through measures like a no-fly zone, through measures like preventing Russian ships from leaving sort of port, ensuring essentially a blockade in the Black Sea area. It means taking these forceful, assertive steps. If NATO doesn't do that, then Russia is going to keep pushing forward. It's going to keep pushing to see how far it can go and how many concessions it can extract. And so that's something that NATO needs to do. That's where the politics of this needs to go in order for there to actually be sort of way to restore peace in Europe through a balance of power, but I don't see NATO doing that. Their caution is what's their Achilles heel in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, on a last note, if you don't mind, there's about lobbyists, and the number one person lobbied in the government is Bolsonaro, the tourist minister. So, do you see something coming on that, or how do you read the tea leaves on that? Well, maybe in our budget we'll see something, or is it finally tourism saying, "Hey, give us a break"? I haven't heard much about it besides, and then being in Niagara Falls, except the complaints of everything that Canada was being considered closed. But worldwide, whether it was 100% the case or not, the message leaving Canada was we're not open for tourism, and that's what I keep hearing from the hotel association. So imagine they're aware of what's.
So, David, you're in Niagara Falls. You know this better than most, that the tourism sector was absolutely devastated by the pandemic. They were closed, there were shutdowns, they couldn't get customers from other countries, primarily the United States, coming across to spend their monies here in Canada, and that was devastating. So it's no surprise that the tourism minister is the one who's being most lobbied right now, because all these associations are begging and pleading for measures to be either support from the government or for all these measures, the last bit of measures. We still need sort of proof of vaccination and other things to cross the border, etc., to basically do away with these things as the pandemic sort of comes to an end. That's what the tourism sector is lobbying for right now. As to whether or not they'll get it is more or less unlikely, because ultimately there is still a substantial plurality, well, maybe not a plurality, but a substantial faction of Canadian public opinion that is still absolutely paranoid about the pandemic. They are the overcautious people. They're the ones who pushed for lockdowns and got them over most of the pandemic, and they're still sort of driving the agenda to a small degree, but still to a significant one. So I don't think we're going to see, the effects of that lobbying unless it involves sort of measures to ensure that the tourism sector is financially supported, perhaps some aid programs in this budget. But that's sort of where I see this going. And as for the sort of lobbying in principle that happens the day that the Liberal government sort of decides to crack down on lobbying, and by extension on consultants, is the day, frankly, that pigs are going to fly, because that is the biggest revolving door industry for Liberal insiders, for Liberal strategists. All governments get lobbied, all government members become lobbyists, or most of them become lobbyists, and so they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot when that is their next gig after they get their MP's pension. I don't think we're going to see any regulation over there. As for tourism lobbying, there may be some minor benefits, as I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, hey, thank you, Mr. Singh, for the outstanding insights again. Really do appreciate it, and maybe you can come on next weekend if you're available. I know things get.
Well, John, David, thank you very much. I keep saying sort of John sometimes because your name is sort of David and John, but thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I enjoy discussing sort of the politics of our country to try and, make sense of what's going on for Canadians. And I'm very grateful to, you and the Safe Space Cafe for trying to carry that across. Mainstream media isn't always as welcoming to, heterodox perspectives, but you fill that gap. And so it's really incredible, and I'm always happy to help.
Outstanding. Well, thank you. And again, and have a good week.
Likewise, you too.
Bye. Thanks. Have a good day, man.